Merci, bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être ici pour notre première conférence de presse pour cette session de l'automne 2018. Comme chef de Parti vert du Canada, j'ai hâte pour le moment des débats importants pour les citoyens et citoyennes du Canada. This fall, we're seeing a lot of important legislation come up. And of course, just moments ago, we delayed this press conference because of a vote bringing in a time allocation, cutting off debate on one of the important issues that I wanted to discuss at this press conference, which is the acceptance of the new version of the TPP, the CPTPP, which is a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, leaves out a lot of the Pacific nations that one might think would be in it, and of course the U.S. has walked away. My most significant concern, and I will be speaking to this concern when we resume, now that the vote for time allocation has carried. By the way, the Liberals and Conservatives worked together on this, and that way they were able to use a procedural method, thanks to Conservative support, that eliminated the usual requirement for a half an hour's debate on the fact that the government is allocating time to Bill C-79 to bring in the TPP. I will be speaking to particularly the most offensive sections of this new trade deal, which, like others before it, assume that somehow part of any trade deal is an investor-state dispute resolution process. This has nothing to do with trade. Investor-state dispute systems, let me repeat, have nothing to do with access to markets. They have nothing to do with trade agreements. They were a novel introduction to Chapter 11 NAFTA, in which the initial attempt was to ensure that companies that invested in Canada, as in built plants here, had physical assets here. If anyone were to expropriate physical assets, you owe compensation. That is actually what Canada's NAFTA negotiators thought they were negotiating at the time, because I questioned them about it when we had this abomination of the first case, which was the Ethel Corporation case in the 90s. Well, what on earth were you doing? Ironically, by the way, Chapter 11 of NAFTA was never part of the debate about NAFTA. The groups that organized against NAFTA, such as Council of Canadians, didn't notice Chapter 11. No one did. There were concerns about, are we selling out our water? What does it mean for Canadian healthcare? Nobody mentioned Chapter 11 because it was a sleeper section. It wasn't until it was activated by clever lawyers who figured out they could be global ambulance chasers and find any instance where a foreign corporation thought its expectation of profits had been reduced by something a government had done. Nothing to do with unfair trade practices. Nothing to do with trade at all. And Canada has been at the losing end more than any other industrialized country with this now burgeoning process and burgeoning acceptance of the idea that foreign corporations have superior rights to Canadian corporations. So that remains a very large concern I have about the TPP, and now it's being rushed through. So once again, Canadian parliamentarians will really not understand what they're passing. And I say that with all due respect to my colleagues. They do not understand what they are passing. We have a lot of concerns. Overall, I support Bill C-76, the Elections Modernization Act. C'est vraiment important de faire un projet de loi comme ça pour réparer le dommage de notre système des élections, de notre démocratie, qui a été fait par le dernier gouvernement de l'ancien Premier ministre, Stephen Harper. We remember the Unfair Elections Act that Harper brought in. C-76 was originally introduced or most of it was introduced in December 2016 as C-33. C-33 disappeared and reemerged this spring as C-76. So most of what's in C-76 is getting rid of the things that were done by Harper to make it harder to vote, for instance, getting rid of vouching, to make it harder for the chief electoral officer to warn Canadians or educate Canadians. It's a very good piece of legislation. C-76 adds in efforts to deal with cybersecurity and two very problematic sections. The changes around privacy are wholly inadequate. I attempted to amend the Elections Act under Harper to say that political parties in Canada are subject to the Privacy Act. I will try again when we get to committee on this piece of legislation. The other problematic part is the creation of a debates commission. I fully support the idea of greater certainty and rules around our leadership debate in Canadian elections. Unfortunately, the timing of this act and the way it's structured will increase uncertainty. We'll be running out the clock to get this legislation passed in time to appoint a debates commissioner. And against the advice before the committee, and I was in committee during the debates on the debate commission, the strong advice from the Television Consortium and the advice from the Chief Electoral Officer and Elections Canada was that the criteria by which political party leaders are allowed to participate in national televised leaders debates, the criteria should be in the legislation. And when C-76 emerged, I was very disappointed to see that there were no criteria. So if you look at how this is going to play out, and I don't think this has gotten much media attention yet, we're going to be right into the pre-writ period of the 2019 election, appointing a debates commissioner who, unless this bill is amended, is going to have a discretion to decide who's in the debates or not. And it will create distance from the politicians who may have picked a debates commissioner hoping that they structured it a certain way. We need to have fair debates. We need certainty about which political leaders are in debates. And certainly, the rules that Consortium has operated under since the 1960s should continue, that any leader of a political party who has won a seat in the House of Commons, even one seat, means inclusion in the leaders' debates. I think this particular issue hasn't gotten much attention yet, but it will be coming before the committee soon. There's also a lot of concern, as you can imagine, with the Trans-Pacific Pipe, the Trans-Canada, the Trans-Mountain Pipeline Agreement and Kinder Morgan. I'm baffled that the government rushed to give the $4.5 billion check to Kinder Morgan the very day after the permits were annulled. There was no reason to rush. The agreement for purchase and sale of Trans Mountain did not include a closing date. They had time to study the agreement, study the court decision, and decide if it wouldn't be a good idea to get out of wasting $4.5 billion of public funds on a 65-year-old pipeline that has absolutely nothing to do with the next proposal that Canadians should pay $10 billion more at a minimum to build an expansion. So the two issues are bizarre, that we would buy an older pipeline as an excuse to build a newer pipeline for which we have no permits. And lastly, and probably most importantly, next month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change will be submitting a long-awaited report that was mandated in Paris at COP21. And this is a report to let world leaders know how we have to, what level of action we need to achieve in order to hit our Paris target. So, en octobre, le groupe d'experts intergouvernemental sur l'évolution du climat publiera son rapport conformément au mandat de COP21. Il considérera très certainement que l'engagement actuel du Canada est lamentablement inadequate. And I say that knowing that the Harper target of 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, which remains Canada's target, unchanged under Prime Minister Trudeau and new Environment Minister, not that new anymore, Catherine McKenna. The target is unchanged. It is incompatible with the Paris target. It is not possible to imagine that our current target, if achieved, would allow Canada to pull our fair share of the global weight to ensure that global average temperature does not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. It is, at this moment, an emergency. We spent a summer of 500 wildfires through British Columbia, fires through northern Ontario, a spring of flooding in the Maritimes. We experienced globally, and we are experiencing this very day, event after event that smash all previous records because we're in a climate emergency. And if we don't act, we'll look back on the summer of 2018 as the time when things were nice. We have to do far more, and the report next October is critical. And I hope that we will see Trudeau and his administration decide it's time to improve our target and bring in meaningful climate action in advance of the next climate negotiations, which will take place in Poland in December. And with that, I'm going to stop. And I know we only have 6 minutes for questions. I apologize. But the Press Theatre and Press Gallery very kindly allowed me a 15-minute slot to accommodate the fact that we had votes right at 11 o'clock. So je suis disponible pour les questions en français ou en anglais également.
So why are you not at the G7 meetings in Halifax today?
I wasn't invited. I don't go places where I'm not invited.
Why weren't you invited? Did you ask them why you weren't invited?
No, I haven't. The G7 summit meetings, the last time I was actually invited to an environment ministers summit on the G7 wasn't when I was a member of parliament even. It was when I was executive director of Sierra Club of Canada, and Sheila Copps invited me when she had environment ministers gathered in Hamilton in, I think it was 96. So I have to say I didn't expect to be invited. I do ask, for instance, if it's a UN conference, and I expect that there would be, for instance, on the Conference on the Oceans and Fisheries in June of last year, and Minister of Fisheries Dominic LeBlanc invited me to that. I've been invited, although not formally yet, but I certainly understand informally that we will continue the practice of having opposition members of parliament in the climate negotiations. So I expect to be going to COP24. I will be going to COP24, but I expect to be going as a member of the Canadian government delegation for furthering climate negotiations. I don't know if any opposition MPs were invited, but I would expect not.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so last night, Justin Trudeau did an interview with Paul Wells at Maclean's, and he was very firm on Trans Mountain as well. What does this tell you about the Trudeau government's reluctance to kind of admit that maybe it wasn't the best decision because the Canadian public is kind of two minds of the pipeline?
The tragedy of this issue is that there is a solution. There is a middle ground that could allow the Alberta economy to get an immediate infusion of help, particularly for jobs, and avoid a very divisive conflict across this country. And that is that we should not be exporting raw bitumen to other countries for refining. By the way, in 2011, that was the position of the Conservative Party of Canada. In the 2011 election, Stephen Harper opposed pipelines to British Columbia because the Conservative Party policy in 2011 was we should not be shipping bitumen to countries for refining that didn't have environmental standards as solid as Canada's around refining. We need to build refineries in Canada. We need to build upgraders, and the place to build them is in Alberta. Then we're not having this really painful argument about shipping raw bitumen out of Canada. And the difficulty with expanding pipeline capacity is that it's all about increasing production in the oil sands. So the climate goals and building refineries can be aligned. The climate goals and building pipelines cannot be aligned, because building pipelines is about trying to expand to a market that currently does not exist. We're trying to get China interested in buying our bitumen, because right now they're not interested. And ironically, it's PetroChina that just announced it's building a refinery in Alberta. So if the government of Canada is now abandoning the promise to get rid of subsidies for fossil fuels, and believe me, spending $15 billion on first the $4.5 billion to buy the old pipeline and then another $10 billion minimum to build the new one, this is a huge violation of the commitment in the Liberal platform to end fossil fuel subsidies. This is a brand new one, and it's a whopper. But if we're in the business of oil and gas in the government of Canada, the place to put our money is in creating jobs in Alberta, good, long-term union jobs. Build it as a cooperative refinery. Let the unions run it. I don't care if it ever makes a cent. It creates jobs, and then we can use that product in Canada and stop importing foreign oil. And the Energy East pipeline, by the way, to Eastern Canada was never about delivering bitumen to refineries in Eastern Canada, because they can't process bitumen either. It was also an export-only pipeline with a small proportion of Bakken shale that could go to Irving. But overall, that was an export pipeline. Obviously, Keystone's an export pipeline. The idea that we're going to build Kinder Morgan's expansion and get a better price is all fiction. And the idea that this is about jobs, fiction. Kinder Morgan's own evidence to the National Energy Board was that the completion of the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion will create 90 permanent jobs, and in construction, 2,500 jobs a year for 2 years. That's why Unifor, the largest union in the oil sands, opposed and opposes the Kinder Morgan expansion. It had expert evidence to bring before the National Energy Board that building the Kinder Morgan expansion would hurt Canadian jobs. And the National Energy Board ruled that Unifor's evidence was not acceptable because the National Energy Board said that jobs were outside the mandate of the NEB review. So not only was tanker traffic outside the NEB review, and not only was climate impacts outside the NEB review, job creation was outside the NEB review. Yeah. Well, okay, can we continue in the hallway quickly?
I'm going to be safe then.
Okay.
If you have a few minutes afterwards.
Okay. Thank you very much.